What we're going to cover will be basic skills needed. So where do we want to be before we start thinking about landing in fields? Different landing options, different areas we can land in. What kind of fields we're looking for when we do go about our first field landing or any field landing. Executing a successful field landing once we've chosen a field. What to do next once we're in it, and when do we decide to do all of this? So when do we commit? So first of all, what skills do we need? So legally, we need bronze and cross-country endorsement before we can really start thinking about doing this kind of stuff. With good reason. Most of the skills we actually require aren't actually part of the cross-country endorsement. We learn most of it during bronze. So during the bronze, we obviously touch up on our speed control, make sure that that's almost not perfect. And we learn good and not digital approach control, by which I mean we use the air brakes quite dynamically, so we can land exactly where we want rather than the kind of on-off we sometimes see in kind of early pilots. We get comfortable with low level handling, so we're not afraid to kind of maneuver the glider at lower levels. We appreciate that we need to keep an eye on speed in relation to height, stuff like that. We get used to always being at least one option ahead. So the bronze will put us in unusual situations sometimes, and we're used to kind of having options in our pocket to deal with that, and perhaps even a few more options in case our first one doesn't go well. So we get used to being sort of a few steps ahead of the aircraft, and we're decisive with those options. So once we commit to do something, we're happy to go ahead and do it. Lastly, not so much as kind of a bronze and cross-country endorsement thing, but a good skill to have is to know your aircraft. So whichever glider you're flying, if you've got a good amount of time in that glider and you've done a decent amount of kind of launches, landings, that's always going to help. So as an example, well, I'll tell you what, first we've got a spot test. So this is the first interactive element. I ask, what is worse in any kind of situation? A, undershooting, or two, overshooting. And I'm curious to see if anyone's got any answers to that. Obviously, this would have been easier in the clubhouse, but if anyone wants to shout out, then please feel free.
Overshooting. Right.
Is worse.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I'd agree with Clive. Overshooting.
Okay.
You don't want to go into the wall and undershoot.
Yeah.
I would argue it depends on the context of the situation you're in at the time.
Okay, so the answer is, hang about, what's happened here? Oh God, hold on. The answer is they're both terrible. They're both as bad as each other. There's no better or worse. So often when teaching people to fly, I find people will preference overshooting because they feel like they're not going to make the airfield, and that's what they're worried about. But overshooting's okay because, of course, we learned at Wormingford, and it's a mile long. In terms of kind of a practical reason, that doesn't work.
Right, I've muted him.
Cool. Right, in terms of a practical reason, that doesn't work. That field where this picture was taken was one of mine in Wales, and that field is this field here. Let me grab the laser pointer. That's this field here. And the glider ended up in this top corner, just here, that's where the photo is. Wind was from what we call the north of this photo, and the approach had to be made from this corner upwards. And the reason I couldn't use the longer run here, it was because these trees were quite tall and these buildings were actually higher. They're sort of uphill. So this wasn't an option, and this was the best run. To give you an idea of scale, I've put Wormingford here to the same scale next to this field. So you see it's not actually dissimilar. We've got a road here in the same place. The airfield boundary, as it were, is more or less in the same place. And the end of the field is kind of at the end of our trailer park here. The issue with this field is that on this, what we call the southern boundary, were some telephone wires. So that approach had to be made about 45 knots with full air brake over these wires in order for the glider to stop in this top corner. And we can see from here, obviously undershooting isn't going to be a great idea because we've got the road. This field isn't big enough. It's the same width as the field before the runway at Wormingford. And we've got obviously the lines and the hedge here. So undershooting is not an option, but nor is overshooting because we've got a fence on the boundary here, trees at the end, and it's just not pretty either way. So the point I'm trying to make is that when you're landing in a field, they're both as bad as each other. You must put the glider where you want it and not go too far or not far enough. Does that make sense? I don't know why I'm asking, everyone's muted, but I'll assume it does. So a little bit of that comes back to knowing your aircraft. So I could do that with confidence in the Nimbus because I know it will approach at that kind of low speed with full flap and full air brake. And I know that it will land reasonably short. I know that the wheel brake works. And in my back pocket, I still have things like the tail chute. But all of these things are worth knowing. So with your aircraft, get used to its characteristics in side slip, what you can do with the flaps if you need to. Does your wheel brake work? If you've got a drag chute, things like that, and make sure you're kind of comfortable using them. All right. So that's the skills we need. Now we move on to different landing options. Obviously, this one's a poor one. Don't go for that. But we have got several options when we're flying cross country. For example, we've got gliding sites, other gliding clubs, really good options. I mean, arguably the best fields you can choose because you can probably get a launch out of one. They're going to be quite accommodating. There's normally like tea and coffee, that kind of thing. So that's a pretty solid choice. As well as gliding sites, that's Husbos, by the way, if anyone's curious. As well as that, we've got other airfields, so other kind of GA airfields. This is Popham, which again is probably quite accommodating. Slightly different in that you may well need to kind of speak to them, so you'll have to have a reasonable amount of confidence on the radio. But I think you know, in this day and age, I think anyone flying cross country probably has got the skills to do that. And yeah, most GA sites are a very good option for a land out as well. Although you probably will still need a road retrieve unless you've got someone who can aerotail you out and they're happy to do that. Some other airfields are better options than others. A lot of you might recognise this. This is Mildenhall. You could land here. Again, you'd have to kind of speak to them, but it's likely to be quite a lot more hassle than if you landed somewhere like Popham. The military especially can be quite funny about gliders landing because they don't know what kind of a threat we are, basically. So yeah, it is an option, but probably not the most convenient. So other than that, we've got the bulk of this talk, which is fields. Plenty of fields, a lot more available than kind of gliding clubs and airfields, and we'll kind of talk about which ones to choose, of course, and some of these are obviously better than others as well. But of course, the best field, the one we all want to land in, and the ideal choice, if you have got the choice, is home. So if you can stay airborne and get around, that's always going to be your best option and your shortest day. Now, how do we choose a field? I've gone a bit to town on this slide because it reminded me of PowerPoint in the 90s. So there's a lot of clip art and stuff. Please bear with. How we choose a field, what the BGA come up with, and what you'll see in a lot of kind of literature about this is using S's. So we'll go through that. So the BGA say all of the S's, I think there's 7 of them, and a W, because they couldn't find a way to make wind begin with S. And some of the others they've shoehorned in a little bit, which you'll see. So we start with the W, that's wind. We all know how wind affects, how we land. So that's obviously going to be a factor. First S, these are all more or less in order of priority as well. So these is kind of the order we actually look at things when we're choosing a field. So we've got wind. Next is size. That's the best thing I could find to represent it. Next, we've got the shape of the field itself. I couldn't represent slope as a picture, so you've got Father Jack Hackett rolling uphill in a wheelchair. That's the best I could find. Apologies. As well as slope, we've then got surface. So what's on top of the field? What crops it? What does it look like? Stock. It's a little bit shoehorned. It's basically animals, but they needed something that begins with S. And surrounds, which used to be string, which is even worse, but it's basically obstacles. So trees, wires, buildings, roads, that kind of thing. So we'll run through these one by one. So, and sorry, my last tip, stay airborne. This is the best option. If you can do this, you don't need any of this. 1S, much better than 7. So that's Alex's tip of the evening, just stay airborne. But failing that, how do we determine wind? Pretty straightforward from this picture, but we've got various ways we can tell what the wind's doing. So we've got previously known. So what was the wind when we took off? We knew what direction we took off at Wormingford. We know what the wind was like on the ground when we launched, and it's unlikely to be vastly different. So we've got that as a kind of baseline. We've also got the forecast wind. So if it's due to increase in the day, we know in the back of our minds that it's due to increase, or it has increased. More and more nowadays, we've got wind indicated by navigation instruments, and some of these are better than others. So it's up to you kind of how much you trust yours. I've got the S100. That's very good. It's got like pitot input as well, so you don't have to circle for it to determine wind, and it tends to be very reliable. But if you were using an old GPS 3 and a LX or something like that, or a 160, then perhaps look at other features too. But yeah, we're spoilt now by some of our nav kit. Going back, what I learned back in the day with all of this was to look at more ground features, and I still do that, in relation with everything else, just to kind of get confirmation. So we're just looking at Beaufort scale stuff. So things like smoke, wind turbines now, really good. They're all over the place. I've put use something in addition to avoid 180-degree error. So obviously we know the wind turbines pointed into wind, but it looks the same on both sides. So, if you've got some other indication as well, like in this picture, it's easier to see what side of the turbine the wind is coming from, but use something else as well. Trees, long crop and water ripples. So obviously you can see ripples in water, and you can also see ripples in crop when it's long, and obviously see trees blowing. You'll get a general idea of the wind direction from that. And drift's not a terribly reliable one, because it relies on you flying the aircraft very accurately, and you're probably going to have to be quite low to get a real indication. So that's I would say quite a last resort. Cloud shadows, fairly obvious. We can see what way the cloud shadows are moving if the wind's strong enough.
Can I just say something about that, Alex, or could I just ask you? Because
Yeah, go for it.
when I've used cloud shadows before, you
Yeah.
have to keep looking out the cockpit window for quite a long time, especially if the wind's not hugely strong. If the wind's only 10 knots at the at height,
Yeah.
it can be hard to see the movement and the direction of the cloud shadow without really concentrating on it, and then you're not really looking out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I mean, really, these are kind of in order of reliability and usability. So it's one of the kind of the last resorts, if you will. It's very unusual. You're going to be looking at landing out, and you're not going to have somewhere nearby a wind turbine, some smoke, or some crop that's long enough to see it move, or some water or something like that. Assuming you haven't got any nav kit that works out wind or anything anyway. So it's kind of like if there's absolutely nothing else, that's one of the things you can use. But these are more or less in order of usability. So yeah, cloud shadows aren't, you can tell the wind from them, but like you say, you will, unless it's a very strong wind, you'll probably have to watch it for a little while to get a real indication. And of course, it doesn't tell you surface wind. It only tells you what the wind's doing at cloud base. Which won't be spot on, but it gives you a general idea of kind of the flow. So another kind of unreliable one is other gliders. So if you see another glider in a field, it's probably landed into wind. But if you're using that as an indication of wind, because none of these other indications are there, then they won't have been there for that glider either. So it's not necessarily a reliable way of telling. All good. So that's wind. Obviously, we want to land into wind. It, vastly reduces our ground speed, the distance required for landing. It gives us a steeper approach. So we always want to land into wind where possible. We know that just from as a basic of aviation. We can accept a crosswind in a field if it's light and the field is appropriate for it, but really we want to preference landing into wind where possible, never downwind, certainly into any unknown kind of landing area. So next we've got size. So as an indication of size, Wormingford's boundary where the trees are about 300 meters from where the launch point normally sits at the east end. So realistically we need 300 meters plus to comfortably land. Unfortunately, that's pretty meaningless because how do we know what 300 meters is? There's no kind of ruler. So we have to get a picture in our head of how much area we need to land. And the easiest way to do that is with the relative size of objects. So for example, at Wormingford, we've got the hangar and the trailers and everything like that. And we're probably used to kind of how large they look in relation to the landing area. We need to use similar features when we're landing in a field as well. Take care to use objects like roads, vehicles, houses, rather than other fields, because small fields among smaller fields look big, right? So just because you've got a selection of fields and you look at the biggest one, it doesn't mean that it's a big field. You need to look at other features as well to kind of get a real indication of size. And I think I've put here, buildings, trees, vehicles, etc. And generally start with the biggest field and work down from there. So amongst all those other criteria, all of those other S's and the W, where size is concerned, if we start with the absolute biggest field, do our little checklist with that, and if it meets all the criteria, great, just land in the biggest one. Normally it's massive, right? But it's much better that way than if it's tiny. If the biggest field doesn't tick all those boxes, if it's full of a really tall crop or something like that, then go for the next biggest and sort of keep working down until you've got one that's suitable. So that's size. Next is shape. Shape is an interesting one. It's very rare that there's a field that's not a suitable shape to land in. but it does depend on the wind. So this is just a snapshot of some countryside. I've highlighted on this some different shapes. We all know what shapes are, but this is to highlight the usefulness of the shape will depend on the size of the field and the wind. So I've added in some wind just to give us an idea. So you can see this immediately changes everything. So with the wind from, let's say the west, and assume this is north up, this field here now, this long and thin one, is effectively useless. If the wind was from the north, this might be worth considering, but actually now it's a very short and wide runway. This field here, also perhaps if we were kind of landing diagonally across this, it might be suitable. Reality is that's too small and there's all sorts of trees and stuff around it, but purely from shape, that would be usable in this direction. But in this wind direction, we probably wouldn't consider it. So we can kind of discount those two. Looking at this now, this field here, again, it's obviously very suitable in terms of the shape. If we've got a north-south wind, there's a very long usable length up and down here. But across, it's much narrower. So we can obviously discount that one as well in these conditions, which leaves these two. I mean, it's obvious which one wins so far out of these two, but this one here would be landable perhaps on this kind of longer area here. So you'll find some fields that are kind of narrow at one side and wide at the other. And that's obviously a shape factor worth considering. You, of course, use this longer edge rather than the shorter one. But purely based on what we've discussed so far, so shape and size effectively, we'd probably choose this field here because it's lined up nicely into wind. It's the bigger of the options, and there's a nice long run into wind. In reality, this actually from this picture isn't a very good field, but yeah, just looking at what we've discussed so far, that kind of makes the point. If it was me in real life, I'd probably use either this one here or this one here. But that's looking at some other factors that we'll discuss shortly. So slope, that shape, it's fairly self-explanatory shape. So slope, landing upslope can be useful if the previous criteria are not ideal. So if the field isn't big, or if the shape is such that you haven't got a really long kind of ground run, landing upslope can be useful because it obviously reduces our ground run, decelerates us faster. It means we need less space to land. But we generally want to preference flat fields. So we can find one that's big enough and flat. It's going to be nicer for us to land in. If there is a noticeable slope, you must land up it. So that doesn't matter what the wind's doing, nothing. If there is a noticeable slope, you have to land uphill. If that's going to give you a horrendous tailwind, then really you don't want to be landing in that field at all. You want to look at something else. But always, if there's a slope, land uphill. And remember, if you do, increase your approach speed, probably 5-10 knots, sometimes more if it's steeper, just to give you the energy to be able to round out, because you will need a lot more energy to round out uphill. So yeah, slope can be useful. However, there can be too much, of course. Generally, if the slope is visible from 1,500 feet upwards, it's too steep. So I mean, this photo is Loch Mick in Scotland. This was probably taken from about 10,000 feet. And there's very obvious slope. You can see that it's hilly. And having been on the ground here, I can tell you, I mean, these sides are, it's almost like a cliff face. So if you can see the slope from altitude, it is too steep. Just don't consider it. Clues for slope, even shallower slope, might be rivers. So rivers will tend to be at the bottom. This is an extreme example, but you can see you've got a river here and the ground does slope down towards that. So with clues like that, I suggest you just do a sanity check before committing to the circuit. So if you've chosen a nice field and it's nice and big and you know the right shape and everything like that, if you're looking at flying a circuit and then approaching and there's a river at the end of it that you're approaching towards, just double check that it's not downhill, because there's a good chance it might be. And so just bear that in mind and you know, make sure before you commit. So that's slope. I hope that all makes sense. So next is probably the one that most people focus on the most, which is the surface. So your first preference with surface is always going to be something short. So not like in this picture, that's obviously not that short. Really, you want to be looking at a field like this. This is a stubble field, absolutely ideal, and it's basically an airfield. So we want to go for something short. You might say grass. Grass is a popular material for airfields, but when it's not an airfield, it's not always as good an idea as you'd expect. So typically grassland might be things like set aside, which can be problematic because you don't know what kind of what stuff's in it. And sometimes you've got sort of hidden machinery, irrigation, big divots, stuff like that. Or it might be something like a common or a playing field, which can be okay, but you don't want to be turning finals and then having a group of people out walking a dog come in front of you. And a lot of grassland is a kind of public area, so it's not often a great choice. Not when things like stubble exist. So, like in this picture, there is no reason not to land in a field like that and preference grass, because it's actually lower risk to land in things like stubble. Accepting, of course, that you will have every now and again you've got a couple of obstacles, which are hay bales and, of course, cow's eggs. So watch out for both of those things when you're landing, but both obviously stand out very well. So when there's not stubble, that's obviously quite seasonal. Up until probably mid to late July, these fields will be quite long with wheat. Most other short crop is acceptable as well. So really our first priority, like I mentioned earlier, is length. We're looking for something short first of all. And how do we tell that? So this next slide, this is a long crop. This is what that stubble used to look like effectively. So how do we know? How do we tell from height what's long and what's short? First of all, using this corn or this wheat as an example, it's not just lighting. This long stuff really does look more golden. So this wheat, when it's long, is a kind of darker color or a more golden color. And once it's cut, it's more of a kind of brown. And that goes for the green crops as well. They're a dark green when they're long, and they're a kind of light browny green when they're cut. So the color is your first indication, which you'll get from just flying just locally. You'll see the colors change throughout the year. And second of all, these lines are deep and obvious. So these kind of tractor wheelings in long crop are very obvious. You can see them from a long way away, and you can, as you get near to a field, and especially lower, you can sort of gauge a depth with them. So if you've got big, thick, deep lines, that's a good indication that your crop's quite tall. Lastly, another good indication, the top of the field moves with the wind. So any long crop, if there's a breeze, will move. If your field's got waves in it, it's probably too long. All right. So an example of a short crop might be this one here. So this could be anything. It's perhaps like a young sugar beet or something. It doesn't really matter what type of crop it is. It just needs to be short. And a lot of young crop will look like this. Now, in general, if you can see lots of earth through the greenery, it will be quite short. So here you can see quite a lot of brown. Even in this picture, you can see this sort of brown through it. That's more and more obvious at height. So if you've got kind of brown with green in it, that's almost certainly a short crop, and it's probably going to look quite similar to this picture, which is again fine to land in. You just want to land with the lines. You see the direction this glider's facing is with these up and down lines here. So you want to pick one that's got those lines into wind, ideally. It might be entirely brown, your field, and then it's either probably ploughed or harrowed. Both of these are landable. Ploughed is not as ideal, as you've probably got some quite big rocks and bits like that in there, but the glider will cope with it. And harrowed is obviously a bit more refined. Both of these will be very soft. You'll probably stop very, very quickly, and it can be a bit of a pain to get the glider out again, but they are kind of acceptable options if that's all you've got about. So taller crop can be landable, but you do have to be careful because it's extremely difficult to tell the difference. I've put here between 2 feet and 8 feet tall, but basically it's hard to gauge length. It can be, if you can see that it's long enough to be moving, it could be over head height. So do be very, very careful if you do have to land in tall crop, but you should find you won't be in a situation where you have to. You've probably gone wrong if you do.
What would your advice be, Alex, if you did find that you'd chosen the wrong field?
Yeah.
And you were committed, but you now realise that the crop is quite tall?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because my honest advice would be don't end up in that situation. But yeah, I accept that it can still happen. In terms of, I've got no experience of it, Adrian, but my understanding is you basically want to fly onto the top of, you treat the top of the crop as the ground. So you want to fly down into that with absolute minimum airspeed. So you would effectively round out above the top of whatever crop it is. And when the glider effectively stops flying, it then descends into it. So you're kind of going in with minimal airspeed and ground speed. But yeah, I mean, my honest advice would be don't do it, because there's a much greater chance you'll damage something. There's a good chance you'll get away with it, but there's a much greater chance you'll actually cause damage than if you just landed something short.
And there's a quick comment from Jonathan saying it looks like those two gliders chose different directions to land in.
It does, yeah. I don't actually know the story behind that one, but yeah, curious. I mean, there's actually, I think, not an unreasonable chance that one of those is ground looped, looking at the length of the crop. So it's quite possible that they both come in from the same direction, but yeah, I don't know the story behind it. I found that on the internet.
Yes, yeah, no, quite likely a ground loop, as you say.
So no-goes. So what do we absolutely not want to go for? Obviously, this girl wasn't having the best day getting this glider out. So how do we avoid something like that? So we don't want to go for. I've got 4 examples. This probably isn't exhaustive, but it's all I can really think of that you absolutely wouldn't want to land in. So first of all, wet mud. The glider's probably going to get away with that. You'll be okay, but the retrieve's going to be an absolute nightmare, and you will be cleaning mud out of the undercarriage probably for the rest of the year. So I would avoid that really at all costs. Secondly, the one that pretty much everyone knows, oilseed rape. I've put the most courteous of the no-goes because it's the only crop that's bright yellow, so it's really easy to avoid. But it will damage the glider probably 100% of the time if it's ripe. So it's just a big avoid. It's basically like flying into trees, but easy to avoid at least. Third, I've got maize. So this is what was grown around the airfield last year. I think I've put this year, but yeah, it's what was growing around the airfield. So, you know, it was what, 8 foot tall. Even if you could land without damage, you'd never find the glider again. You might not even be able to get out the field. It would just be a nightmare. So avoid maize. I think peas as well can be quite tall, but you know, any crop above head height is absolutely a no-go. And potato, so like ridge and furrow, it's not impossible to land in ridge and furrow, but I've put very high risk as the furrows are very deep. So if you do, you never ever land across, so always land with the furrows. But it's really a last resort, because there probably is going to be some kind of damage if you have to resort to that. So general rules for your surface: shorter the surface, the better. Obviously mentioned that earlier. Always land with the lines, never across. Stubble fields are normally best when available. So after July, stubble fields are great. Just, you know, it takes a lot of the work out of choosing your surface. And always approach grass with caution. All right. So that surface. Next we got stock. So animals, basically avoid. People go into lots of detail about animals, but I'm not gonna overdo it. Fields containing animals are unlikely to be suitable, so they'll be full of fences. I've not even mentioned things like pigs, because the fields are full of little huts and you'd never consider landing in it anyway. Even if they're not full of fences and things like that, animals themselves are unpredictable. So your landing area is not consistent, because they can always wander around your field. So it's very hard to kind of set an area and land in it without risk of one of them kind of running in front of you. The only animals you're probably likely to fight, certainly in this country, the only ones you're likely to come across are cows, sheep, and horses. And none of these are a good idea. Like cows are very curious. They walk on the glider, they lick it. They'll cause quite a lot of damage just by the sheer weight of the thing. They're not aggressive, but they can do a lot of damage. Sheep are quite curious. You can probably, if you landed in a field of sheep without hitting one, and you could stay with the glider the entire time, you could probably be okay, because they're easy to chase away. But you'd have to stay with the glider the entire time, and you'd have to land without hitting one in the first place. And horses, people say horses tend to get nervous. My experience of this has been horse owners tend to get quite nervous, and the most grief I think you'll probably ever get out of landing in a field is if you land near horses. But that's just my experience. But certainly avoid landing in a field with horses, and if you can, avoid landing in a field next to them. For us, places like Newmarket, I think they get very grumpy if you land on the gallops. So yeah, they're just best to avoid. So lastly, we've got surrounds. So wires, pylons, fairly obvious one. Roads, trees, hedges, bales, basically any kind of obstructions we might come across. And most fields are going to have some bits and bobs around them. I've gone into a little bit of detail about why we want to consider this in relation kind of with everything else as well. And I've used a little sort of power flying slide here, so you'll have to forgive that. But the reason surrounds are important is because they reduce what's called the effective length of our landing area. So here's an example of an aircraft landing with no obstacles onto a runway. And you've got the effective length of that runway is the length that's usable by that aircraft. So in this case, it's actually landing beyond the threshold, as you would if it's a proper runway, but for the purposes of gliding, the effective length of the landing area would be this whole length. However, if we've got an obstacle there, so if we grew some trees at this boundary, it's with super high-tech PowerPoint there, you can see that this now isn't going to work. We can't approach, if we say we've got full air brake, and on this descent here, this approach isn't going to work anymore. We have to come in higher at that same angle to clear those trees. So if we come in a bit higher so we can clear them at this same approach angle, we're now landing a lot further down the runway. So our effective length is now much shorter. That is now the length of the runway that's usable to us. This bit here is useless. And in general, that as a rule, I would say if you've got a 100-foot obstacle at the boundary of the field, in most kind of modern gliders with full air brakes, you're probably doing about 8-to-1. So that means the first 800 feet of that field is unusable. So it's worth bearing in mind when you've got things on the approach, how much of that field is rendered useless. As a quick point, that's where things like the Jesus flaps on an ASW20 and things like tail shoots, that's basically what they're designed for, is to kind of get around this problem, because then we can come in with, let's say, an angle of maybe 3 or 4-to-1 and a much steeper approach to get over these obstacles, but still use some of the field. So some gliders do have tools to kind of combat that. But nonetheless, the obstacles are always going to be a consideration, and that would affect the way you approach that. So that's pretty much what would affect it. So wires and pylons, of course, we don't want to hit them. We'd have to come in over the top. Roads are an interesting one, because if you've got a country road, I mean, it's flat. It's not, you know, it's not reducing that length, but you must consider that something's going to drive on it. So really, you know, that road is as high as a double-decker bus or a lorry, because if you are approaching and then something like that appears, you want to be able to have the length of field beyond it to kind of clear it and carry on. So you must consider a road as an obstacle. Trees and hedges, pretty obvious, and bales you'll find in the field itself, and they don't move. So, you know, they're easy to see, they don't move. So if you can choose a landing area between or around them, then bales are easy to kind of get around. And anything else, any kind of vehicles parked on the field, or, you know, tractors, combines, stuff like that. We've got wires and pylons, so they can be quite hard to see. The wires are arguably impossible to see. So you look for the pylons. So I've took this snapshot from kind of Google Earth, and it's fairly obvious to see where the pylons are here, because the tractor can't mow through them. So you'll generally find on fields they're marked with the kind of the tracks as they go around the pylons, and then we just draw the dots. We know that there's going to be a wire there and there and there and there. In general, if they're going straight across a field, they will go straight across a field. So if there was another circle over here, I would be cautious, because you might find that it changes direction, but generally it will go straight across the field like that. So that's your wire. And of course you could still land in this if you were kind of parallel, or even if this southern bit of the field was big enough to land kind of before, or even roll underneath. That doesn't write the field off, but you must keep a good eye out for wires and kind of plan around them. But mostly stay airborne. That was my last S. Always the better option. Again, don't let all of that kind of choice hinder remaining airborne. If there's lift, then climbing it. It saves you a lot of extra work. So that's how we choose a field. This bit's quite straightforward. How do we land in it? Like this, really easy. We're probably all familiar with this. It's no different. Landing in a field is, I can't stress enough, no different to landing at home. It's the same. We do the same circuit, same approach, everything. When we learn to land at Wormingford or whatever gliding club, we're learning to land in an area, not at an airfield, and that doesn't change. Things to watch out for: watch out not to cramp your circuit, because your landing area, you know, is smaller, and visually that's going to have an impact, because if you're used to flying a circuit around Wormingford and using kind of the far end of the runway as your high key and things like that, that's obviously not gonna work. So watch out not to cramp your circuit, and position your high key properly. So properly kind of upwind and to one side, but really upwind, not just on the far boundary, because it's probably quite short. But other than that, I mean, the basics are the basics. If you do mess up or if it goes a bit wrong, don't be afraid to use air brake. You can use it, you know, it's a flight control, use it at any point. If it's looking too cramped, too high, and there's little else you can do about it, don't be afraid to use the brakes. Just do what you need to get it down, you know, on your reference point.
Alex,
yeah.
sorry, I was just going to ask, in terms of the field that you select, you often one reads in various publications where it says, don't just have a plan A, have a plan B, or possibly a plan C if you can. Obviously, that's not always possible depending on the terrain and the size of the fields that you're flying over. But what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with that more. And I haven't really got a diagram appropriate for it, but when you choose a field, typically you'll have maybe 1, 2, or 3 in order of preference. So, of course, during the whole process of selecting a field, you know, out of the landscape available below, you will go over several different options. You're not just going to look at one and go, yeah, that's the best one. You will naturally look at several. And I will tend to kind of preference in my head, you know, what the better option is. And the reason you might need other options is as you get lower, you'll perhaps find that something has changed. Like you'll notice a fence, for example, or something like that, which is, you know, so it's nice to have another option like a plan B to fall back on. Some people will also talk about undershoot and overshoot, which I think is probably what your question relates to, where you would choose a field maybe here and here. In reality, this is what I learned when I was learning to do field landings, and you choose a field and you'd have a field in the undershoot, which is also suitable, and a field in the overshoot, which is also suitable. And I've not gone into this in this talk because in East Anglia, that's fine. Yeah, great. You can choose a field and you can choose another field here and you can choose one here, and they're all great. And, you know, and that's that. If you fly in most other areas of the country, that's just not possible. It's not practical. There aren't 3 fields in a row that are landable. So I'd prefer to kind of hammer in, like, get your approach right and land in the field you want to land in. And because there will be situations where there isn't another one ahead of it, or there isn't another one behind it. But I do accept, certainly in this part of the world, that yeah, you can have an undershoot or an overshoot, and it's not a bad idea to have that chosen, especially if you're kind of early stages and you're not sure, you know, you're not sure you're going to make it. Then yeah, you know, it's not a bad option to have. But I've sort of purposely not gone into that too much, if that makes sense.
Sure.
I don't know, the BGA might be a bit grumpy about that, but I personally think that a lot of the undershoot overshoot choices were more to do with getting the motor glider that you were doing the training in back out again than actual practical sort of purposes. But anyway, so you landed in your field. So what now? First and foremost, like, before you even get out of the glider, call your crew, get them on the road. You might be hours away. Just get them moving, and you'll feel a lot better. You know, when you call them in half an hour and they've actually left. That's quite nice. So get your crew moving first and foremost. Secure the glider. So take any bits out that you want to take out. Some people take the UDIs out and stuff like that. Maybe grab your Camelback so you've got something to drink, that kind of stuff. And then find the landowner if possible. So we want to keep up good relations. Also, we want a nice, easy retrieve. Just walk to like the nearest building. You've probably seen a building when you've been looking at your field. There'll always be one nearby. There's a good chance it's someone who's something to do with the field you've landed in. And if it's not, they probably know whose field it is. And just let them know what's happened. And just sort of basically tell them that how you're going to get out. So you've got a trailer come in. This is how we do it. 9 times out of 10, they'll be absolutely fine with that. Well, 8 times out of 10, they'll be fine with that. 1 time out of 10, they'll help, and 1 time out of 10, they'll be a bit grumpy. But that is what it is, and you've got to get your glider out. So they'll just sort of come up with a plan, but try and come up with a plan that's kind of mutually agreeable. They'll probably tell you how to get in and out the field. If not, find access. So find where the nearest road is, where the gate is, how to actually get there, so you can guide your crew in when they arrive. Do all your prep. So you want to, it's bugbear of mine if you go and pick someone up and they've not done this, but take all your tape off, disconnect your battery, disconnect your controls if you've got controls that disconnect. Do all of that if you can first, so you're not faffing around taking wing tape off when the crew arrive, because they've had a long drive as well. They just want to get on with it, as do you. However, do not remove any bits of the glider, like your tailplane or tips, purely because if anyone flies over, they'll look down and it will look like you've crashed, and then you end up with emergency services and all sorts. So leave your glider in one piece, so it looks like it's landed. All right. Then if you've got time, find some food, go and get something to eat, because you're probably hungry and you don't want to be de-rigging late in the day, low on energy. You probably had a long flight. So yeah, if there's time, you've got a bit of time to wait, go and get some chips or something. So lastly, when do we do all of this? Obviously not at this stage. You know, when you're nice and high, you don't have to consider this at all. But basically, we want a good option. We want a field to land in chosen by about 1,000 feet. That's really the only kind of firm rule. The height that we need to start narrowing that down depends on several things. It depends on time of year, the area, part of the world. I've already said East Anglia is easy, but you know, what part of the country are we in? What part of the world? What's the terrain like ahead on your task? What's the lift like? And what's your skill level? How quickly can you choose a field? How experienced are you at kind of picking fields out? So all of these will affect the height at which we start narrowing down our options to have a good option by 1,000 feet. And I've just chucked in a couple of kind of visual examples. So here's one. I think this looks like it is East Anglia late in the season. And you can see that there's good options. All of these fields are great. We don't need to we don't need to pick one in particular. We can just glance and go, yeah, that's great. There's options there, to the extent where actually we can try this next cloud. And if that doesn't work, these fields over here all look great as well. So we can push quite confidently over here, because we know it's not going to take too long to pick one out of all of these, because there's going to be some decent ones in there. So we can just keep going, and we'll find some lift under this cloud and carry on. So we're thinking about it here, but only to the point of making sure that there's options ahead, and we're happy with that. Conversely, this next picture is taken from slightly higher. There's no options ahead here. This is a much worse picture. Even though we're higher, we might really want to think about what to do here. So actually, in this situation, this glide is on glide. So there's, there is an option. They're going to an airfield. If they weren't, we'd want to make sure that we are within glide of an airfield or a landable area. And if we don't know that, then I don't want to fly into this without knowing that I can glide clear. So I'd either want to climb here where we are, or perhaps if we're over something landable, we might want to try one or two of these clouds, just until we can still glide back to where we are here. But the point is, we're thinking about it much earlier, and we're actually thinking about choosing a field now, even though we're higher than in this last slide. Finally, so this one, we're much lower. In fact, we're at a height where we probably want to have a field chosen, but there's a good chance we won't need it. So some of you might remember this is Didcot back in the day. We're almost certainly going to climb here, but we're at a height where we do want to have options. luckily there are some. So we've got, I don't know what the wind direction is this day, but we've got a couple of nice fields at 90 degrees here. There's even one here that's suitable for, this is a K6. So there's plenty of options, and they're all nearby good sources of lift. So coming back to stay airborne, there's a good chance we can stay airborne here, but we're at a height where we have a field chosen in case we can't. So the one exception, it's the last thing I'm going to cover, one exception of where we might choose a field late, or is it? So final glide. You've probably seen gliders that have landed out on final glide, 2 or 3 kilometers from the finish. So is an exception. Do we choose a field really late on final glide? The answer is no. No, we don't. Arguably, we choose that field sooner because we choose that field well in advance. So when we're final gliding to an airfield, we've got the advantage of having already been at that airfield earlier. If it's a competition or if it's worming field, we've been there a lot. So we might look at the fields to the north, typically a worming field will come in from, so we can look at them while we're local soaring and choose some depending on the time of year, just to have options for if we're low coming back, we know what 1, 2, 3, 4 fields are landable and we can bear them in mind. So that gives us some local knowledge. If it's a competition, then we'll look in the start zone. So we know for any given day what direction we're coming back from, and we can have a look at the fields for the last, maybe 10K. We can just have a look and make sure that there's good options coming in from that direction. And if there's not, of course, then we wouldn't want to embark on a marginal glide anyway. We'd perhaps 10K away think there's no landable fields between me and the airfield. So make sure you have the extra margin. And if you don't, you can commit to land out at that earlier stage. So no, final glide's not an exception. And we actually choose those fields even earlier, despite making the decision to go into them quite late. So yeah, comp start zone, or even just a walk around the airfield. So this one was at Aston Down. Anyone that's flown at Aston Down will know that there is no landable fields in this direction or from this direction, apart from these last ones. There's a really nasty valley to the left here. But this glider here has almost made it, and they've chosen this field at the beginning of the week. This is halfway through a competition week, and they did a walk around the airfield on day one just to have a look at the fields, in the immediate vicinity, and unfortunately ended up needing one. But they'd actually walked on this field, so they knew it was landable, and it was easy to commit to land last minute. So that's that. Any questions?
So, Alex, you covered decision heights,
yes,
and you sort of talked a bit about depending on pilot skill, and so on. But just for ordinary mortals, what do you think? Not many of us are experienced competition pilots, and we may have only landed out, once or twice previously, or not at all. So.
Yeah. So what height should you be making a decision, do you mean?
Yeah, and thinking about fields. I mean, personally, I think about fields anytime I'm below 2,000 feet. It starts coming to the fore in my mind. Even if I think I'm okay and I'm heading to another cloud that I'm expecting to work, I'm still thinking, I'm looking at the ground and looking at the fields and considering what might happen.
Yeah, no, well, that's interesting. So that's kind of the point I was making is yes, you are looking at that stage, but what you're not doing at 2,000 feet is choosing a field, right? So as you get to 2,000 feet, you're considering the fields available, and you even said sort of looking at the next cloud. So you look at that next cloud and where you're going to get that next climb from, and just look ahead and make sure that area that you're heading towards looks landable, or even looks similar to the area that you're over, right? So that's the first stage of kind of thinking about landing in a field. but though you're thinking about it at that point, you're not actually kind of choosing. You're just considering it. And when you actually start choosing, it's hard to say because it is dependent on your experience. But if you can comfortably look down and choose a field within, let's say, 200 feet of altitude, you need to just look around in an area that's landable. Just look around and pick 2 or 3 and kind of refine that. Then really you can start doing that at 1,200 feet, because the one consistent thing is you want something chosen by 1,000, and it's kind of on you, how much above 1,000 feet you need to kind of have that decision locked in. But if you're over a landable area, you've looked at 2,000 feet, you're going, yeah, I'm heading towards a landable area, there's loads of landable fields, then it's probably not going to take very long to actually make a choice out of those fields. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, I'd say think about it early, but don't commit to it too early, because it comes back to that, stay airborne. Don't let your kind of choosing and the focus on that pull away from that next climb, because actually you're probably going to climb, and you've got a kind of balance. You've got that balance of looking at a field and keeping your options open to actually just staying airborne. And it's important not to let one take over the other.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Can you go back to the slide which showed you a number of options of fields, Alex?
Yeah, hold on a sec, let me find it.
One of the early slides.
Was it the one with the shapes on it?
Yes. Yes.
This one?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Where it says wind.
Yeah.
Yeah, just below it, and to the left, the one that you said would be quite a good field.
This one, yeah.
No, that one. Even so, that would, to me, that looks like that's going uphill.
Yeah.
Into wind, uphill.
Yeah.
Further to our would be west, assuming north is top of frame.
Yeah.
Okay. We can't see it, but assuming the land rises, would that field be subject to any curl over from those trees and the wind coming over the top of that hill?
Possibly, yes. It's very hard to tell, like you say, from this picture, because we don't actually know what the terrain over here is doing beyond this point. But yes, yeah, the answer is yeah, possibly. It depends how strong the wind is.
Yeah.
And kind of what terrain's going on back here. But yeah, that is something to consider. So if you've got, certainly if you're looking at slopey fields as well, with strong wind in slopey areas, there can be a lot of local effects, and even just from these trees. Yeah, with the information available to us from this picture.
Well, the picture's limited information, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like I say, I mean, I think that on the face of it, this one or this one are quite good choices.
I would go for that one in my limited experience, which is very limited.
Yeah.
Can I also point out that there's pylons in the lower half of this frame?
Yeah, along here. Yeah.
Shadows on the ground.
Yeah.
Yes. So the one that's still highlighted.
Yeah.
That's going to limit your approach into that field.
It is, yeah. Also, well, like I said, when I sort of posed this slide, to highlight shape only and not kind of look at the other factors. So in reality, you're right, these pylons would be problematic because they're properly tool electricity pylons as well. So you'd have to kind of...
They look like it at 66,000 volts.
That's it.
And in my previous knowledge gained before I got into a glider, you need to stay a minimum, absolute minimum of 30 feet from those sort of pylons.
Yeah.
Because you will arc. If the pylon, if you are at a substantial different potential from that pylon, you run a risk of drawing an arc.
Yeah.
And perhaps at another time, Jonathan might be able to expand on that, bowing to his superior knowledge on those sort of things. But yes, I would have gone to the one that you just recently gone. in my limited knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, now we're revisiting this. I'll sort of explain what. So this field is, in terms of shape and size and the wind, is a great choice.
Yes.
In terms of everything else, it isn't. So, like you say, you've got the pylons on the approach, which wouldn't be impossible to kind of get around because you can come on the inside of them here.
Yeah.
But it also looks like it's sloping downhill,
Yes.
going into wind, and it also looks like quite a long crop because you can see this very defined kind of lines in it where it's been planted. So it's actually a terrible choice, but it's just to highlight the kind of relationship between shape and wind and size and bits like that.
Accepted. I was just worried about potential curl over.
Yeah.
And of course the pylons. Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Just another question, Alex. Do you mark landable fields in your UDI or other device?
Absolutely not. No, and I think anyone that does is foolish. Purely because landable fields don't stay the same. So each year they'll rotate the crop, and what one year might have been landable, the next year might be horrendous. Well, we know from what's been growing around Wormingford, the crop changes year to year, right? And I'm sure it has been landable in previous years, but if you'd arrived there last year and needed to land in it, you'd have been knackered. So I think it's a terrible idea marking landable fields. What you do by doing that is give yourself confidence to kind of push low to a field that you know is landable, with a chance that it won't be when you arrive there. So I much prefer just to pick them, as I go.
Do you mark land airfields or other gliding sites in your UDI?
Well, they're already on there, so yeah, I'll consider other airfields. I mean, from a racing point of view, I won't divert to other airfields. I'd rather land in a field or risk landing in a field, but go more on track than kind of divert in case I land. But that's a different kettle of fish, really. That's more about kind of flying fast. So yeah, I do. I have. We all have gliding clubs and stuff in our nav, and if I'm low in that kind of area, then I'll consider that. But I won't sort of fly gliding club to gliding club, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. And what about, do you have any thoughts about the time of year for people who are early cross-country pilots and the sort of crop and that sort of thing?
It's a tricky one. It's not one that I'm like terribly in a rush to answer, because I mean, the easy answer is yes. It's the best time of year is going to be post-July, so it's much easier late in the year when everything's been cropped and everything like that. So that's the easy answer. Yeah, if you're really unsure and you want it to be really straightforward, fly in East Anglia in kind of August, and it'll be really straightforward. I don't like to stop anyone from flying cross country who's capable before that, because there are landable fields all year round, but perhaps they'll just want, they want to have a decent level of training and be confident that they can choose, because they are much harder to choose because they're fewer and further between earlier in the year. But I wouldn't say that means you can't go cross country. I just think you need to be prepared for it, for whatever time of year that you're kind of embarking on it.
Okay, thank you. So any other questions?
Hi, Les here.
Can I ask a question?
David, could you let Les go first?
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question regarding when would you decide maybe to land with undercarriage up? What factors would influence that decision?
I don't know if that's. I can't think of a situation where I'd want to, unless you were landing on water. Perhaps you would land with it up. But I mean, on the basis that the talks about field selection and landing, if you have to land with the undercarriage up, you've done something very, very wrong, I think. Situations I could picture where you might want to do it is if it's a very, very steep hill and you're worried about rolling back down it after you've landed. Perhaps you'd want to leave the undercarriage away, but then you might slide down it, I guess, anyway. And yeah, if you were landing in water, I think officially the line is you leave it up. But other than that, I wouldn't see any reason. I know some people have put it up after landing if they've messed up and it's into a short field or they're overshooting perhaps. They've put the wheel up to try and slow down quicker. I don't think that's particularly successful. You're probably better off ground looping if you're really in that situation. But I think if you need to be considering doing that, then you've already gone quite wrong.
Yeah, I was just wondering maybe if in a field that you're approaching you saw some fairly deep furrows, whether you'd be better off with the undercarriage up.
Yeah, no, or nearly. Well, no, always better with it down. Glider undercarriage is built with field landing in mind, so they know you're going to be using it to land in fields, and it's incredibly strong, and sometimes quite tall for that reason. So if you look at things like a DG1000, the reason the undercarriage is so tall and you need a step ladder to get into it is because of that situation. Because you're better off getting the belly of the glider away from the ground than closer. So even if it's really deep, you want the wheel down so you stand a chance of keeping the rocks and stuff away from your fiberglass, because the tire and the undercarriage will deal with it, but the belly of the glider won't. So yeah, I just always put it down, I think.
Okay, thanks for that.
David, you had a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Alex, what's the lowest you've got down to before you've actually managed to climb away?
I don't know if I should say, Dave.
Difficult one to answer. No, be interested.
I mean,
I think Mark Butcher told me once 400 feet.
I mean, the lowest I've climbed away was a thermal I entered whilst turning finals to the field. I'll just leave it at that, and we'll.
Okay.
You don't recommend that, presumably, Alex, for people who are not experienced?
No, it's a difficult. I was hoping this subject wouldn't come up because it's a difficult one to broach, and I never like saying something you can't do something, because often things, in aviation are possible, and if you've got the right kind of skills and consider the right things, then it's okay. But it's very difficult I can't tell people what height you can and can't get away from, because there are so many other factors involved. So, for example, when I have got away from fields very low, considerations I would have in my head are: what's the wind doing? What other fields are available? So if I turn in this thermal and I get a load of sink, is there a field behind me that I could land in? How much will I drift if I don't gain too much height, or even if I lose some height? Can I still make the field that I'm turning finals to? And all of these factors are going around in a split-second decision as to whether or not I turn or continue the turn to climb. So if you can consider all of those factors, then you can get away from quite low. But there are an enormous amount of factors to consider, and it's very, very easy to get it wrong. So certainly, if you're inexperienced, or even if you think you can do it but you're not entirely sure, or you've not done it before, I'd say just don't do it, because it is ultimately much safer just to land. But it is possible to climb away from quite low. I think that's the best way I can put it.
Thanks. So I think Clive's got a question.
Well, it's not a question. Can I add to that discussion?
Go on.
Surely a guiding rule would be, once you've made a decision and you're committed, don't prevaricate. Get on with what your decision was.
Yeah. I mean, if you want my feedback on that, then yes. But things can change. Like my decision might be to fly around a 300, and then I can't get on with that decision, so I have to change it and do something else. I think
That's slightly different now, isn't it? And when you've committed to landing, And you set yourself up.
What I don't agree with is, again, I was taught, I'll use a higher altitude as an example. So I was taught that you commit to your field at 1,000 feet, for example, and you put your wheel down and then you focus on flying your circuit and land at it. And that's not bad advice. Like, you know, yeah, you can do that and that works. But what I don't like about that is if you commit to your field at 1,000 feet and you put your wheel down, you start flying your circuit, and then at 900 feet, you fly into a steady 6 knots. I mean, you'd be an idiot not to take it, wouldn't you? so I hate to, I wouldn't put such a solid rule on it personally, but you're right in that everyone will have their own kind of limit for, you know, when they run out of capacity, and at that point you should, or before that point, you should kind of draw the line. So if you're working at or near you kind of peak efficiency, then call it a day there and just commit to land. But if you've got some spare capacity and some, you know, and some other stuff's going on, if there is 5 or 6 knots, then I wouldn't say don't take it either, as long as it is safe and sensible to do so. But that's you know, down to everyone's personal limitations, I guess.
Yeah.
Super. Any other questions? No. Seems like you've answered all the questions, Alex, with your presentation, and so I would just like to thank you on behalf of everybody for you've obviously put a lot of effort into this slide deck and the talk, and it's been really useful. Some really good discussions, a lot for everybody to think about. So thank you very much on behalf of everyone.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex. Very nice.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, really enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Well done.
Thanks, everyone.
Get well soon.
Yeah, we'll do.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. That was really good. Brilliant.
Cheers, mate.
Right, well, I hope to see you down at Wormingford soon then, Alex, once you've got over this.
Yeah, I should be. I haven't done a test today, actually, but I should be pretty much ready to go again soon. I think another couple of days maybe before I'm technically allowed.
That'd be good. And
yeah,
what comps have you signed up for this year?
At the moment, none. There's potential that Shennington might happen again this year, so I'm kind of holding out to find out what happens with that. But otherwise, I'm under some pressure to do the open class again. So that might happen. I don't know. I don't fancy really landing out a lot for a week, so I might do a regional in preference if I can. But yeah, nothing officially booked at the moment.
Yeah, well, let's hope the soaring season gets going soon. It should only be a month away, shouldn't it?
Yeah, it's getting there, and I think we've had a couple of soaring days so far this year. But yeah, another month or so. It's normally quite good in spring, isn't it?
Yeah, April can be a cracker.
Yeah, hopefully not so much snow and ice this year as last year, but we had some good weather.
Yeah, that was weird, thermaling in snow last May.
Yeah. It was just every day we flew, it was snowing. But yeah, a bit less of that would be nice, but it's better than rain, I suppose. At least it just bounces off.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Right, well, I'm going to go and put the tea on now.
Yeah, likewise.
Right, so thanks very much, everyone. I'll see you later.
See you later on.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
If you like this video, then please click the like button below. Why not subscribe to the Essex and Suffolk Gliding Club channel by clicking the subscribe button and then click on the bell so you get notified when new videos come out. For more details, find us on Facebook or visit our website at esgc.co.uk, where you'll find information on flights, lessons, and club membership.